The small town of Ridgewood wasn't known for much, just a few quiet streets, a diner where everyone seemed to know your name, and the kind of peace that came from everyone minding their business. But peace can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of Ridgewood's seemingly quiet charm, there were undercurrents of tension that no one wanted to talk about. That's where our story begins. On a crisp fall evening when the hum of cicadas was interrupted by something far darker. Jada, a bright and ambitious college sophomore, had just pulled into the parking lot of the local convenience store. She was the kind of young woman who carried herself with confidence, a trait she'd inherited from her father, who just happened to work in one of the most high-stakes fields in the country. But tonight, none of that mattered. Jada was just a regular girl stopping to grab snacks on her way to meet friends for a study session. She had no idea her life was about to change forever. As she walked inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her. Jada barely noticed the uniformed officer standing near the door until he turned to watch her. Officer Brad Malone. Everyone in town knew his name. To some, he was a hero who kept the streets safe. To others, he was a walking nightmare, a man who abused his badge to fuel his power trips. Jada didn't think much of his stare at first. She grabbed her favorite candy and a soda, paid at the counter, and headed back to her car. But before she could even open the door, she heard his voice. "Hey, stop right there." Jada froze, turning slowly to see Malone walking toward her. There was a strange, almost menacing energy in his tone. "Something wrong, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Malone's smirk widened. "Got some questions for you. Mind telling me why you're hanging around here at this hour?" Confused, Jada glanced at the time on her phone. It wasn't even 9 p.m. yet. "I was just grabbing some snacks. Is there a problem?" He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "You seem nervous. Got something to hide?" Jada felt her chest tighten. This didn't feel like a routine question. She'd done nothing wrong, but Malone's tone made her stomach churn. "No, sir," she said firmly. "That's so." He pulled out his flashlight, shining it into her car window. "This your car?" "Yes," Jada replied, her patience starting to wear thin. "It's registered in my name. You can run the plates if you need to." But Malone wasn't interested in checking facts. He'd already made up his mind. In his eyes, Jada wasn't just a college student minding her business, she was a target, and he wasn't about to let her walk away without making his presence felt. "Hands on the hood," he barked. "What?" Jada's voice wavered, the disbelief clear. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Now," Malone yelled, his hand moving toward the cuffs on his belt. Terrified and unsure of what else to do, Jada complied. As Malone roughly grabbed her wrists, slapping on the cold metal of the handcuffs, she felt tears sting her eyes. This wasn't just humiliating, it was wrong. But as Malone was dragging her toward his squad car, a sharp sound pierced the tension. The distinct ring of a cell phone. "Who's calling you?" Malone sneered, pulling her phone from her pocket without permission. His smug grin faded the moment he glanced at the screen. The name flashing across the display wasn't some random friend or family member. It was *** Agent Marcus Bennett ***, a name Malone knew all too well. In that instant, a chill ran through him. Marcus Bennett wasn't just any FBI agent. He was one of the most decorated in the Bureau, known for his relentless pursuit of justice. And more importantly, he wasn't the kind of man you wanted to cross. Malone hesitated, but it was too late. Jada had already looked him in the eye, her fear replaced by a spark of defiance. "You messed with the wrong person," she said quietly. 3 minutes later, the first call came into the Ridgewood Police Department. It wasn't from Marcus Bennett. Not yet. But it was clear something big was about to unfold. Malone had no idea that his actions had just set a chain of events in motion that would bring his entire world crashing down. And when Agent Bennett finally made his move, it wouldn't just be about justice, it would be personal. "Let me know how else you'd like to refine this introduction." The Ridgewood Police Department wasn't accustomed to calls from high-ranking federal agents. The dispatcher, a middle-aged woman named Carol, nearly dropped her headset when the voice on the other end identified himself as Agent Marcus Bennett. He didn't sound angry, at least not yet, but his tone was sharp, clipped, the kind of voice that demanded immediate action. "Put me through to your chief," he said, each word carrying weight. Carol hesitated, fumbling for her directory. Chief Henderson isn't in right now." "I can." "Find him," Agent Bennett interrupted, "and let him know his officer just made the worst mistake of his career." Carol's hands shook as she scribbled down the details. She didn't need to ask what this was about. Malone's reputation had reached every corner of the department. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what the fallout would be when the chief found out that Malone had gone after someone connected to an FBI agent. Meanwhile, in the convenience store parking lot, Jada sat in the back of Malone's squad car, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the muffled sounds of the radio inside the vehicle. Her wrists ached from the cuffs, and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal burned in her chest. She tried to remind herself to stay calm, to breathe, but every glance at Malone's smug expression made her blood boil. He leaned against the hood of his car, casually scrolling through her phone. Malone didn't care about the rules, had broken them too many times to count. He was more concerned with maintaining his so-called authority, and right now, that meant showing this young woman that she was at his mercy. But Jada wasn't just any young woman. She'd grown up watching her father navigate some of the most dangerous cases in the country. Marcus Bennett had always taught her to stand her ground, to trust her instincts, and to never let anyone take her dignity. Even now, as fear threatened to overwhelm her, those lessons echoed in her mind. Malone's radio crackled to life, pulling him from whatever satisfaction he was getting from rifling through her phone. The voice on the other end was tense. "Officer Malone, we've got a situation. Need you to bring the suspect in immediately." "Relax," Malone said lazily into the mic. "I've got everything under control." "Do you?" The voice shot back, uncharacteristically sharp. "Because Chief Henderson is on his way, and he's not happy. You might want to rethink how you're handling this." Malone frowned, his confidence faltering for the first time. He glanced at Jada through the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said it all. She knew exactly who had called. Before Malone could respond, another call came through, this one directly to his personal phone. He hesitated, checking the screen. Unknown number. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it, but something told him that would be a mistake. "Officer Malone," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "This is Agent Marcus Bennett. I believe you're holding my daughter." Malone felt the blood drain from his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Let me be very clear," Agent Bennett continued. "You've made a serious mistake. I'm giving you exactly 3 minutes to release her and issue a formal apology. If you fail to comply, I'll ensure this situation becomes very uncomfortable for you and everyone you work for." Malone swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. His usual bravado felt flimsy under the weight of Bennett's words, but instead of admitting defeat, he doubled down. "Look, Agent Bennett," Malone said, trying to sound authoritative, "your daughter was acting suspiciously. I was just doing my job." Suspiciously. Bennett's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "She bought a soda and some candy. Explain to me how that warrants being handcuffed and thrown into the back of your car." Malone didn't have an answer. He knew this wasn't about suspicion. It never had been. But admitting that would mean exposing himself, and Malone wasn't ready to let go of the fragile power he'd built for himself. "I'm following protocol," Malone said weakly. "You're not," Bennett replied coldly. "But don't worry. I'm on my way to Ridgewood. We'll discuss this in person." The line went dead. Malone stood there for a moment, gripping his phone like it was a lifeline. He glanced back at Jada, who was now watching him intently. Her calm demeanor only made him angrier. "You think your dad's going to scare me?" Malone sneered, more to himself than to her. But Jada didn't answer. She didn't need to. At that moment, the distant sound of sirens broke through the quiet night. 2 squad cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. Chief Henderson stepped out, his expression grim. "Malone," he barked, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "What the hell is going on here?" Malone straightened, trying to salvage what little authority he had left. "Chief, Save it," Henderson snapped. "I've already been briefed." He motioned for one of the other officers to open the squad car and release Jada. The officer hesitated, glancing at Malone. "Now," Henderson barked. The cuffs were off within seconds, and Jada stepped out, rubbing her wrists. She looked at the chief, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and frustration. "Are you okay?" Henderson asked, his tone softening slightly. "I'm fine," Jada said, though her voice wavered. Henderson nodded, then turned his attention back to Malone. "You've crossed the line before, but this is a new low, even for you." "Chief, I was just—" "Save it," Henderson repeated, his voice like steel. "We'll deal with this back at the station." But before anyone could move, the sound of tires screeching into the lot drew everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV came to a stop, and the man who stepped out was impossible to ignore. Marcus Bennett was tall and commanding, his presence filling the space like a storm rolling in. He moved with purpose, his gaze locking onto Malone with an intensity that made the officer take a step back. The chief tried to intervene. "Agent Bennett, I assure you." Bennett held up a hand, silencing him. His focus was entirely on Malone. "You," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You had no idea who you were messing with." Malone opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, he felt small, exposed, and utterly powerless. And as Bennett took another step closer, the tension in the air was palpable. "I warned you," Bennett said, "and now you're going to learn exactly what happens when you cross the line. Let me know if you'd like further refinements or the next part of the story." Marcus Bennett's presence wasn't just commanding, it was suffocating, especially for Officer Malone. The man who had strutted around the parking lot only moments ago now looked like he wanted to shrink into the shadows. Bennett didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. The sheer weight of his stare was enough to unnerve anyone. Chief Henderson stepped forward cautiously, trying to de-escalate the brewing storm. "Agent Bennett," he began, "I want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously. I've already started an internal review and—" "I didn't drive all this way for a review," Bennett interrupted, his tone sharp but measured. He turned his gaze toward the chief, softening it just slightly. "This isn't just about a bad decision. This is about abuse of power, and I'm not letting it slide." Henderson nodded, his expression grim. He'd been trying to keep Malone in check for years, but the officer always seemed to slip through the cracks. Complaints had been filed, too many to ignore, but none of them had ever led to real consequences. Now, with an FBI agent breathing down his neck, Henderson knew the time for excuses was over. "Daddy," Jada said quietly, breaking the silence. Bennett's expression shifted as he looked at his daughter. His hardened exterior softened, and for a moment, the intimidating federal agent was replaced by a concerned father. He crossed the parking lot in a few quick strides and pulled Jada into a protective hug. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I'm fine now," she said, though her voice wavered. "But it was awful." Bennett closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of her words. When he opened them, the storm was back. He turned to Malone, who was still frozen in place. "Get in the car," Henderson barked at Malone, his patience clearly gone. Malone hesitated, glancing between the chief and Bennett. "Chief, I said get in the car," Henderson roared, his voice echoing through the lot. For once, Malone obeyed without argument, climbing into the back of one of the squad cars. As the vehicle pulled away, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. If anything, it seemed to thicken. Bennett turned back to Henderson. "What happens next?" "I'll handle it," Henderson said firmly. "With respect, that's not enough," Bennett replied. "I've seen how situations like this play out. A slap on the wrist, a quiet transfer, and then it happens again in some other town." Henderson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked tired, like a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "You're right," he admitted, "but it's not as simple as firing him outright. There are procedures, unions, politics." "Save the excuses," Bennett said, his voice cold. "If you can't do what needs to be done, I will." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of their shared understanding hanging in the air. Finally, Henderson nodded. "Let me at least try to do this the right way," he said. Bennett didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Jada, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "This isn't over," Bennett said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I wouldn't expect it to be," Henderson replied. The chief walked back to his remaining squad car, leaving Bennett and Jada alone in the parking lot. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Bennett said, breaking the silence. "It's not your fault," Jada replied, "but I'm glad you came." Bennett nodded, his jaw tightening. "You know I'll always come for you." Jada gave him a small, grateful smile, but the tension between them was still palpable. This wasn't just about what had happened tonight. It was about the years of warnings and lessons that had led up to it. "You always told me to be careful," Jada said softly, "but I didn't think it would happen to me." "It shouldn't happen to anyone," Bennett said, his voice filled with quiet fury. The drive back to Jada's apartment was silent, but the air was thick with unspoken words. When they arrived, Bennett parked the SUV and turned to her. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked. Jada shook her head. "I'll be okay. I need some time to process everything." Bennett hesitated, clearly torn. "If you need anything, you call me, no matter what time it is." "I will," Jada promised. He watched as she unlocked her door and stepped inside, waiting until the light flicked on before driving away. But instead of heading home, Bennett made a call. "Tom," he said when the line picked up, "I need a favor." The man on the other end was an old colleague from Bennett's FBI days. Tom was retired now, but he still had connections that could dig deeper than official channels. "Let me guess," Tom said. "This is about that Ridgewood cop." "You've already heard?" Bennett asked, surprised. "Word travels fast," Tom replied. "Malone's been on the radar for a while. A real piece of work, that one." "I need everything you've got on him," Bennett said. "You planning to take this to the Bureau?" Tom asked. "Not yet," Bennett replied. "I just want to know exactly what I'm dealing with." "Understood," Tom said. "I'll send you what I have by morning." As Bennett ended the call, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He wasn't just going to rely on the system to fix this. He'd seen too many cases where justice was delayed or denied altogether. Back at the station, Malone sat in an interrogation room, staring at the cold, grey walls. He'd never been on this side of the table before, and the reality of his situation was starting to sink in. Across town, Jada lay in bed, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that her father's arrival had changed everything, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, the town of Ridgewood held its breath. What had started as a quiet evening was now the beginning of a reckoning, one that would reveal just how far some people were willing to go for justice. The stillness of the night seemed deceptive, as though the town of Ridgewood was holding its breath. Inside her apartment, Jada sat curled up on the couch, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. She felt the sting of anger and humiliation rise anew every time she thought of Malone's smug face. Despite her father's reassurances, the knot in her stomach refused to unravel. She knew him too well. His calm exterior always hid the relentless storm brewing underneath. Meanwhile, Marcus Bennett was far from calm. He drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, his thoughts racing. The information Tom had promised still hadn't come through, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the silence. "Got something for you," Tom's voice came through. "It's bad, Marcus. Real bad." Bennett gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "How bad?" "Malone's got a history," Tom said, his voice low. "Reports of misconduct, harassment, even excessive force. Most of it got buried, either by his buddies on the force or people higher up who didn't want the bad press. But here's the kicker. There's an open complaint that's still under review. A woman claimed he planted evidence on her brother during a traffic stop. The kid's been sitting in jail for 6 months now." Bennett's jaw clenched, and no one's done anything about it. "Welcome to the system," Tom said bitterly. "The guy's a pro at walking the line. He's careful, never enough evidence to nail him outright, but enough to leave a trail if you're looking for it." "Send me everything," Bennett said. "It's already on its way," Tom replied. "But Marcus, what are you planning to do?" "Whatever it takes," Tom sighed. "Just be careful. Guys like Malone, they've got friends in all the wrong places." As Bennett ended the call, his phone pinged with an incoming email. He pulled over to the side of the road and opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. Each word added fuel to the fire burning inside him. This wasn't just about Jada anymore. This was about every person Malone had hurt, every life he disrupted while hiding behind a badge. Back at the station, Chief Henderson sat in his office, staring at the report he'd just pulled on Malone. He'd always known the officer was a problem, but seeing it all laid out in black and white was damning. The weight of his own inaction pressed heavily on his shoulders. He'd let this go on for too long, brushing off complaints and ignoring red flags in the name of department unity. Now he was paying the price. In the interrogation room, Malone sat hunched over, his usual bravado gone. He knew the walls were closing in, but he wasn't ready to go down without a fight. He'd spent years building his shield of excuses and alliances, and he wasn't about to let one bad night tear it all apart. The door to the room opened, and Henderson stepped in. His expression was unreadable as he sat across from Malone, placing a folder on the table between them. "What's this?" Malone asked, his voice defensive. Henderson didn't answer immediately. He opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. "This," he said finally, "is every complaint filed against you in the last 5 years. You've been skating on thin ice for a long time, Malone. Tonight you fell through." Malone's face darkened. "You don't have anything on me," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not yet," Henderson admitted, "but Agent Bennett does, and he's not someone you want to mess with." The mention of Bennett sent a chill through Malone. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some semblance of control. What's he gonna do? Drag me to federal court over a parking lot scuffle? Henderson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about tonight. This is about every time you thought you were untouchable. And Bennett, he's the guy who touches the untouchable." As Malone processed the words, the tension in the room thickened. He wasn't used to being cornered, and the realization that he was running out of options sent a surge of panic through him. At the same time, Bennett was back in his SUV, making calls and piecing together a plan. He wasn't going to rely on Henderson to handle this. It was clear the chief's hands were tied by bureaucracy and politics. No, this required a different approach, one that didn't follow the rules Malone had so expertly exploited. Jada, unable to sleep, decided to distract herself by scrolling through her phone. But instead of finding comfort, she stumbled upon a post from someone in her neighborhood, a grainy photo of her in the back of Malone's squad car, accompanied by a caption that twisted the story entirely. Her heart sank. This was what she'd feared most. The internet didn't care about the truth, it cared about spectacle. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling, as the comments rolled in, some supportive, others cruel and judgmental. She dialed her father's number. "Dad," she said when he picked up, her voice shaking. "It's online. Someone posted about what happened." "I saw it," Bennett said. "Don't let it get to you. We'll fix this." "But how?" Jada asked, her voice cracking. "People already think the worst." "They'll think differently when the truth comes out," Bennett said firmly. Jada wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered in her mind. The damage felt too big, too overwhelming. She didn't know how anyone, her father included, could put the pieces back together. The night stretched on, the tension building like a storm ready to break. Every character in this unfolding drama, Bennett, Jada, Henderson, Malone, moved through their own maze of thoughts and decisions, unaware of how close they were to colliding in a moment that would change everything. And as the clock crept closer to dawn, Ridgewood's quiet streets felt like a fuse, burning slowly but steadily toward an inevitable explosion. As the first rays of sunlight broke over Ridgewood, the weight of the night's events lingered like a fog over the town. Jada had barely slept, her mind a storm of fear, anger, and questions. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, making her flinch. She reached for it, expecting another barrage of comments or calls from well-meaning friends. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "*You think the truth will set you free? Be careful what you dig up. *" Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, she thought it might be some cruel joke, a troll trying to get under her skin. But something about the tone felt different. This wasn't just about humiliation, it was a warning. Across town, Marcus Bennett sat in his car, scanning through the files Tom had sent overnight. Every page painted a clearer picture of Malone, a man who had left a trail of destruction while dodging accountability at every turn. But the deeper Bennett dug, the more uneasy he felt. One document stood out, a complaint filed anonymously about a year ago. The details were vague, but it mentioned a possible connection between Malone and a local business, an auto shop known for shady dealings. Bennett's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just about Malone's behavior on the job, there was something larger at play. He made another call, this time to a contact who specialized in financial investigations. "I need you to look into something for me," Bennett said. "A place called Ridgewood Auto. See if there's any connection to Officer Malone." "I'll get back to you," the voice on the other end replied. Back at the station, Chief Henderson was reviewing the same files Bennett had obtained. He felt a sinking pit in his stomach as he pieced together the implications. Malone's actions weren't just about ego or power. They pointed to something far more organized, something that could blow up in all their faces if exposed. Malone, still in the station's holding room, seemed eerily calm. He knew the walls were closing in, but he also knew things that no one else in that building did, secrets that could protect him if he played his cards right. Just as Henderson was considering his next move, his office phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the words made his blood run cold. "Chief, you've got a problem. Bennett's digging into Ridgewood Auto, and if he finds what I think he's looking for, we're all in deep trouble." Henderson's grip tightened on the receiver. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," the voice continued, "that Malone isn't the only one with dirt on his hands. If Bennett keeps pulling at this thread, he's going to unravel things you don't want unraveled." Henderson felt the weight of the warning settle over him. He'd suspected for years that some officers were involved in under-the-table dealings, but he'd turned a blind eye, telling himself it wasn't his fight. Now that negligence was coming back to haunt him. Meanwhile, Jada couldn't shake the unease from the anonymous text. She forwarded it to her father, knowing he'd want to see it. Moments later, her phone rang. "Where did this come from?" Bennett asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," Jada admitted. "It just showed up." "Don't respond to it," Bennett said. "And don't leave the apartment. I'll be there soon." As he hung up, A new wave of determination surged through him. Whoever was behind the message wasn't just trying to scare Jada, they were trying to silence her. And that meant he was closer to the truth than he realized. Bennett's investigation into Ridgewood Auto revealed a tangled web of corruption. The shop wasn't just fixing cars, it was laundering money for a larger operation, one that involved high-ranking officials and apparently a few cops. Malone wasn't the mastermind, but he was deeply embedded in the operation, using his badge to intimidate and silence anyone who got too close. The pieces began to click into place. Bennett realized that Malone's arrest of Jada wasn't random. She must have stumbled onto something without even realizing it, and Malone had tried to shut her down before she could connect the dots. But the more Bennett uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. His phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from an untraceable number. The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. You don't know what you're dealing with. Walk away before it's too late. Bennett played the message twice, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Malone anymore. This was about a system that had been corrupted from the inside out, and whoever was behind it was willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. As night fell again over Ridgewood, the tension reached a breaking point. Jada's apartment felt like a fortress, but every creak and shadow made her jump. Bennett, armed with the truth but unsure of his next move, prepared for the inevitable showdown. And somewhere in the darkness, forces were moving against them, determined to keep the past hidden, no matter the cost. The night air was heavy with anticipation as Marcus Bennett parked a block away from Ridgewood Auto, his SUV blending into the shadows. He had spent the last few hours meticulously piecing together the operation, connecting Malone and the auto shop to a network of corrupt officials and local businesses. But this wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about justice, for Jada and every other victim who had been silenced. Inside the shop, Malone paced nervously. He'd been released from the station hours earlier, but it wasn't a clean break. Henderson had made it clear that his days on the force were numbered, and worse, Bennett's investigation was closing in fast. Malone's contact at the shop had summoned him for a discussion, but he knew what that really meant. Jada, despite her father's warnings, couldn't sit idle. She had spent the evening poring over the files Bennett had left behind, determined to make sense of the chaos. It was then she noticed something odd. A receipt for a repair dated the same day Malone had arrested her. The name on the invoice wasn't Malone's, but she recognized it, one of his closest friends on the force, an officer who had mysteriously resigned months ago. Her mind raced. What if this wasn't just about silencing her? What if she was a loose end in a much bigger cover-up? She grabbed her phone and called her father. "Dad," she said urgently, "I found something. Malone isn't working alone. There's a name on a receipt. It's connected to an officer who quit last year. This whole thing might be bigger than we thought." Bennett listened carefully, his pulse quickening. "Text me a picture of the receipt," he said. "Then stay put, Jada. I mean it." But Jada's curiosity had already pulled her too far in. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her keys and headed for the auto shop. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she needed to be there, like the answers were waiting for her just beyond the locked gates. As Bennett approached the shop on foot, he noticed the faint glow of a flashlight moving inside. His instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind a row of parked cars, his hand instinctively reaching for the small handgun he carried. Malone was inside, arguing with two men who clearly weren't happy with him. "I told you I could handle it," Malone hissed, his voice low but sharp. "Handle it," one of the men shot back. "You've brought the FBI to our doorstep. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before Malone could respond, a loud bang echoed through the building. Everyone froze, their heads turning toward the sound. It was Jada, who had tripped over a loose pipe while trying to sneak closer. "Who the hell is that?" one of the men demanded. Malone's eyes widened in panic. "It's her," he said. "The girl." Bennett, hearing the commotion, moved quickly. He slipped through a side entrance, his gun drawn, scanning the dimly lit shop for his daughter. When he spotted her crouched behind a stack of tires, his heart sank. "Jada," he whispered, motioning for her to stay down. But the men had already seen her. One of them grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to her feet. "You've caused enough trouble," he growled, his grip tightening. "Let her go." Bennett's voice boomed through the shop, his gun trained on the man holding Jada. The room erupted into chaos. Malone lunged for a wrench on the workbench. One of the men reached for a weapon hidden under his jacket, and Bennett moved forward, his focus razor-sharp. In the chaos, Jada managed to elbow her captor in the stomach and break free. She ran toward her father just as Malone swung the wrench, narrowly missing her. Bennett fired a warning shot into the air, the sound freezing everyone in their tracks. "Enough," he shouted. "This ends now." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were outmatched, and they knew it. Slowly, they raised their hands, stepping back from Jada and Bennett. But just as Bennett thought it was over, Malone made one last desperate move. He lunged for a hidden panel on the wall, pressing a button that triggered a hidden compartment to open. Inside was a stack of documents and a small black box. "What's in there?" Bennett demanded, his gun still trained on Malone. Malone smirked, his confidence returning. "Insurance," he said. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against." Bennett took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Try me." Before Malone could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. Henderson had arrived with a team of officers, alerted by Bennett earlier in the evening. As the officers stormed the building, Malone's smirk faded. Henderson approached, his expression grim. "You're done, Malone. All of you." But as the men were handcuffed and led away, Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. He opened the black box, finding a flash drive inside. When he plugged it into his laptop later that night, what he saw confirmed his worst fears: names, transactions, and evidence that pointed to a network far beyond Ridgewood. Jada looked over his shoulder, her eyes wide. "What does this mean?" she asked. Bennett closed the laptop, his jaw tight. "It means this goes deeper than we thought," he said, "and it's not over." As father and daughter sat in the quiet of their apartment, the weight of the night settled over them. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, waiting for their next move. The following morning brought an uneasy calm over Ridgewood. The events of the night before felt like a distant nightmare to Jada as sunlight poured through her apartment window. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug, her thoughts swirling. Her father sat across from her, his laptop open and the flash drive plugged in. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Bennett exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Now, I turn this over to the Bureau," he said. "This goes far beyond Ridgewood or Malone. There are too many names on this list, too many connections. It's bigger than both of us." Jada nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Do you think they'll do anything about it? I mean, really?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "They'll have to. This kind of evidence is impossible to ignore. But it's not going to be easy. People will fight to keep this buried." Across town, Ridgewood Auto was a scene of chaos. Investigators swarmed the property, pulling files, seizing computers, and uncovering the hidden network Malone had tried so hard to protect. Chief Henderson, though visibly shaken by what had unfolded, stood firm as he gave a press statement later that afternoon. "We have uncovered a web of corruption involving members of the Ridgewood Police Department and other entities," he announced. "We are working closely with federal authorities to ensure justice is served." The statement sent ripples through the community. Residents who had long suspected corruption felt a mix of relief and anger. Others, loyal to the officers implicated, were quick to voice their disbelief. But the facts were undeniable, and as more evidence came to light, the town realized just how deep the rot had spread. For Jada, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Her name was cleared, and the footage from the diner, along with her father's relentless pursuit of the truth, had exposed the lies Malone had used to justify her arrest. Though the online storm of attention eventually died down, she found herself grappling with a new sense of purpose. "This isn't over for me," she told her father one evening. "I want to help. Maybe not as an agent or anything like that, but there has to be a way to make a difference." Bennett smiled at her, pride evident in his expression. "You've already made a difference," he said. "But if this is the path you want, I'll support you every step of the way." In the weeks that followed, Bennett worked tirelessly with the FBI task force assigned to the case. The flash drive proved to be the key to unraveling a criminal network that spanned multiple states, involving not just dirty cops, but also local politicians and business owners. Malone, faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, eventually struck a deal to cooperate, providing critical information that led to even more arrests. Jada, meanwhile, found herself drawn to community advocacy. She began volunteering with organizations focused on police reform and supporting victims of injustice. Her experience had opened her eyes to the broader systemic issues that needed addressing, and she was determined to be a part of the solution. One day, as she stood outside a community center after a meeting, she received a text from her father. It was a simple message: *, they got him. *. She immediately knew what it meant. The leader of the network Malone had been protecting, a shadowy figure known only by an alias, had finally been identified and arrested. It felt like a victory, albeit a bittersweet one. Later that evening, Bennett joined her at the apartment. "It's over," he said, though his tone was cautious. "At least, this part is. The rest, well, that's up to the courts and the people to keep pushing for change." Jada nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "We can't let this happen again," she said.